Hi, I'm Evelyn. I used to be a normal kid and used to think of my life as completely ordinary, maybe even borderline boring. The only thing that made my life stand out was the fact that I was the only girl in a family with 5 children. I had 4 younger brothers. But recently, everything changed. So much that I feel like I'm living in a TV series full of drama and complications. My dad's new job actually started a life-changing cycle of events. One evening, he just came home from work and said that he was going to sell our house and move to another state. He did it, in a way. Well, with a dramatic sigh and an upset look on his face, so that everybody thought that it was bad news. Mum was setting the table at that moment, and she even dropped a plate on the floor. But Dad turned out to be a bad actor. He suddenly smiled happily and widely and announced that soon we were going to become a really wealthy family. At first, everybody was a little worried about the upcoming changes because it meant that my brothers and I had to switch to new schools and find new friends and stuff, But as soon as my parents found a place to live, which was actually a huge house with a garden and a swimming pool, all of our worry switched to excitement. Imagine, every one of us would now have their own room with our own personal bathroom. So thank God, no more morning waiting in line for the toilet or fighting over being the first to take a shower. Even better, Dad promised to buy me a car since I was about to become a 16-year-old. Nothing could be better than this, and it seemed like nothing could even slightly spoil this life-changing period of my life. The only problem with all this was that we only had 2 weeks to pack our stuff, and since my brothers were far from helpful, I asked my best friend Joshua to help me. Joshua and I had been friends since kindergarten, and he was probably the only one here that I was going to miss a lot. So I was happy that we were able to spend a lot of time together while packing. We decided to start from the attic. There was plenty of stuff there. How was one family able to pile up this much stuff? I kept wondering to myself while sorting through old toys, clothes, photos and much more. Suddenly, Josh came across a nice pink box with my baby stuff in it. Every child in our family had a box like this, and I knew perfectly what they usually contained. The first baby blanket, comforters, something like the first tooth box, and so on. Nothing interesting. But I knew Josh was really obsessed with all the baby stuff. He was like, "Oh my God, what tiny shoes you had," and so on. But then he suddenly found one strange thing deep inside the box, which was actually wrapped in a blanket, as if somebody really wanted to hide it. It was a little wrinkled envelope without a signature or anything, but there was a letter inside, which looked like it was written many years ago. Normally I don't read someone else's correspondence, but this time curiosity got the best of me. Besides, it happened to have been here for my whole life, and nobody had found it before, and that, in and of itself, was amazingly mysterious, It turned out to be a mother-to-daughter letter, full of gentle words of love and adornment, as well as some pieces of advice on wife and husband relationships. I thought this might have been my granny's letter to my mum, but in that case, how did it manage to get into my baby box? By the way, there were no names on it, but everything sounded like the woman who had written it was never going to see her daughter again. It was really strange, though, and touching, so I decided to ask my mum about it. I managed to finally ask later that day when the whole family gathered around the dinner table. At first, neither my mum nor my dad seemed to have a clue about that letter when I mentioned it. But then, when I specified the contents of it, I noticed that the 2 of them shared a fast glance and tried to sort of drop the subject. This seemed pretty suspicious, and after dinner, I once again tried to find out at least something about that letter from my parents. But no luck again, because, my brothers were running around all the time and my dad pretended like he and my mum were too busy with moving and packing stuff. So at some point, they sort of escaped from the living room. The mystery surrounding that letter put me on high alert. However, I couldn't really get my parents to stop and talk for the next couple of days. Josh and I together were just like Sherlock and Watson, making assumptions and thinking over different versions of where that letter could have come from. And when we'd finally reached a point where we couldn't make sense of anything and were thinking that this letter must have been written by a mysterious woman who used to live in our house a long time ago and who might have lost her daughter and left her that letter right before she died, I finally decided to demand someone make sense of it and go and get my parents to confess. I'll never be able to forget what they told me. It turned out that this letter was addressed to me, and it was written by my mother. Not the one who was sitting next to me, but the one who had actually given birth to me. She was my dad's first love and his first wife. Her name was Alice. She died a couple of months after giving birth to me, suffering from some complications after labour. She knew she wasn't going to make it, so she'd left me this letter, sharing the things she really wanted to tell me someday. Dad missed her very much. He knew it would be really hard for him to raise me on his own, so he hired a nanny for me. At first, he even seriously thought about giving custody of me to my dead mum's parents, but he happened to fall in love with that nanny. Soon they got married, and we began living together as a family. I felt tears flow down my face, but my voice seemed to refuse to produce any sounds at all. My parents said that they didn't know about this letter, and that they were planning to tell me everything one day. But since the truth had been revealed now, they were ready to give me all the answers to my questions and all the necessary support. I, in turn, didn't know how to react. Of course, my parents told me everything they knew about my biological mum, and Dad even happened to save a few photos of her, just in case. So later that night, I was sitting in my room, trying to imagine what she was like and what our life would have been like if she hadn't died. I was also crying hard while rereading that letter from her. It was easily understandable that she loved me so much, and that she was so sad that she eventually had to leave me. Of course, I couldn't sleep at all, so I called Josh, and we were on the phone all night long. At least I had a good friend who had never lied to me. I knew when the morning came that my parents would be waiting for my final reaction to everything. At first I felt really distant. I can't say I actually blamed them for not telling me the truth, but when I saw them worried and frightened because they thought they would lose me, I couldn't help but start crying. Mum said I have always been and always will be her little princess and her only daughter, and she'd always loved me, in a special way. Once the peace and harmony in the family had been established again, there was only one unsolved question left. While telling the story, Dad had mentioned my biological mum's parents, and I wondered if they knew that I was born and living somewhere, and why they had never contacted me. It turned out that my grandma had died soon before my dad's second wedding, and Grandpa was now living safely in a retirement home. He didn't want to bother my dad's new family, so he'd become distant. But my parents, at his request, had actually been sending him my birthday photos annually so he could follow me growing up. Thinking about having a grandpa somewhere was tearing me apart. I mean, I definitely couldn't say, "Hi, Grandpa," to a total stranger. He might not actually want to meet me. I also didn't want to hurt anybody else's feelings. You know, I thought that my mum might not be very happy if I went there to talk to him. Besides, together with my parents, we decided not to tell my brothers anything yet. Even I thought they were too young to understand. Josh was the only person who actually knew everything about my feelings. He was really excited by the whole story, by the way, thinking that if he didn't find the letter that day, then I would probably never know anything, you know? And one day, he sort of infused me with determination. Josh said that if I wouldn't at least try to meet my grandpa, who was definitely a very old man, he could die any time now, and he knew I would regret not meeting with him for the rest of my life. I knew this was true, and the next day, which was actually the last day of mine at our old place, Josh and I went to that retirement home to meet my biological grandpa. What can I say? It was really awkward, that meeting. I didn't know what to say or what to ask about, and he seemed to be on the verge of crying during the whole half-an-hour meeting. He said that I resembled his daughter so much in the way that I looked. We had some tea, and he ended up saying that my parents did a really good job raising me to be a nice person. He wasn't that old, by the way, and he promised not to die until I'd come back to see him again. I don't know how to describe the feeling I had after I left my grandpa. but I guess it was more pleasant than anything. Well, now I'm happy to say that we've moved to our new big house and have almost totally settled into the new place. I'm going to be 16 next week, and I will finally get my own personal ride. And one more thing, I told my parents about my visit to meet my grandpa. I just thought that this family wouldn't be able to stand any more secrets. My parents were really surprised, but they didn't actually say that I shouldn't have done it or anything like that. So now I'm going to write a letter to my grandpa where I'll tell him about my life in detail. And in the summer, I plan to visit him again because I have to go back and brag about my new car to John.